Why does the enemy attack you in your weakest area? And what does God want you to do about it? There are places inside you that have been attacked for so long that you started to believe something was wrong with you. The insecurity that rises at the worst moments, the fear of stepping forward when everything in you wants to retreat, the silence that locks your voice when you know you should speak. These weaknesses did not appear by accident. They are not random flaws you picked up along the way. They are clues. They point directly to the areas where your greatest strength was meant to grow. The enemy knows this, and that is why he pushes against you where you feel the most fragile. He is not fighting your weakness. He is fighting the future that weakness is hiding. You might think your fear means you are unqualified. You might think your sensitivity means you are too fragile. You might think your timidity means you were never meant to lead. But look deeper. The pressure you feel in these exact places is a sign of the potential buried beneath them. There are people who carry a natural authority in their spirit, yet their insecurity whispers so loudly that they begin to shrink themselves. Others possess a deep emotional intelligence, capable of perceiving truth before anyone else notices it. Yet they have been convinced that their sensitivity is a flaw. What you see as a limitation is often the birthplace of your calling, still in its early form. Have you noticed how certain struggles repeat themselves? How specific battles seem to follow you from season to season, almost as if something is trying to prevent you from realizing who you are becoming? That repetition is not coincidence. It is resistance. It is the enemy applying pressure where he fears your awakening. If he can keep you focused on what feels broken, you will never discover the strength hidden beneath it. If he can confuse you into believing your weakness disqualifies you, you will never uncover the gift that weakness was designed to reveal. Every voice of comparison, every internal accusation, every doubt that rises to choke your confidence is part of a strategy to keep you from stepping into an identity you barely recognize yet. You have spent years trying to hide the parts of yourself that feel too soft, too shaky, too uncertain. You tried to mute them, thinking they were obstacles. The truth is that these areas hold the potential that threatens the enemy the most. He is not intimidated by the version of you that doubts your worth. He trembles at the version of you that realizes your weakness is not a curse but a calling. When you begin to understand what is buried inside the places you've avoided, you will uncover the strength God planted there long before the battle began. You have been carrying an idea about your weakness that never belonged to you. Someone convinced you that the places where you hesitate are the places where you are disqualified. Someone made you believe that the flaws you fight are proof that you are not meant for anything greater. Yet the truth is far deeper than the stories you have learned to tell yourself. Weakness is rarely a sign of lack. It is often a sign of hidden potential preparing to surface in a form you have never seen before. What you interpret as a fragile part of you is frequently the very place where God is shaping a strength that will not come from human confidence, but from spiritual authority. Weakness acts like a veil placed over a gift that is still in its earliest form. It does not look like a gift because gifts do not appear fully formed. They require shaping, pressure, and the kind of internal stretching that forces growth in places you once feared. When God places something valuable inside a person, He often wraps it in something that looks ordinary or even unwanted. Not because He wants to hide it from you forever, but because He wants to protect it until you are ready to understand what He put inside you. The enemy detects these hidden treasures earlier than you do. He senses the outline of your potential before you ever realize what it is. This is why the areas where you feel most insecure are the areas where spiritual resistance shows up the strongest. You may think the attacks against those fragile parts are signs of your inadequacy, but in reality, they are confirmations of your assignment. If there were no strength developing there, the enemy would have no interest in touching it. Resistance is often a map. It shows you where your identity is trying to emerge. It reveals the very parts of you that carry the promise of transformation. When the enemy applies pressure to your weakness, he is not testing your limits. He is trying to stop the version of you that God is forming beneath the surface. He wants to keep you focused on the shaking, because he knows you will never discover the power that is learning to stabilize inside you. There is also a psychological layer woven into this spiritual dynamic. The human mind often perceives potential as discomfort before it recognizes it as growth. The parts of you that feel most fragile are frequently the ones that are most neurologically wired for purpose. Sensitivity is not fragility. It is heightened awareness waiting to be trained. Fear is not incapacity. It is the energy of vision without direction. The tendency to overthink is not a flaw. It is an analytical strength that has not yet learned how to trust its own perception. In Scripture, God repeatedly chose people whose weaknesses pointed directly to the gifts he wanted to use. Moses felt unworthy of his voice, yet God destined him to speak for a generation. Gideon saw himself as insignificant, yet his very insecurity was the soil where courage would take root. Paul carried a thorn that kept him grounded so that revelation could flow through him without pride distorting its purpose. Your weakness has been speaking, but you have been hearing it through the wrong filter. It is not saying you are incapable. It is saying you are being prepared. It is not announcing your limits. It is announcing your potential. It is trying to draw your attention to a part of yourself you have avoided because you assumed anything that felt painful must also be purposeless. But pain often points to the place where God is constructing something sacred. Instead of seeing your weakness as a barrier, start seeing it as a signpost. It directs you toward the areas of your life where God's transformative work is happening most intensely. It shows you where your next chapter begins. When you stop interpreting your weakness as a threat and start recognizing it as a clue, you no longer shrink under the weight of it. You lean in, you listen, you allow it to teach you about the strength rising beneath it. There is a reason the enemy does not waste time attacking the parts of you that are already strong. Confidence does not intimidate him. Skill does not trouble him. Experience does not shake him. What terrifies him is the potential forming in the areas where you still feel unsure. That is why the pressure concentrates where you feel the least prepared. That is why the doubts echo where you were meant to grow. The enemy is not fighting who you are today. He is fighting who you will become once the weakness he targeted develops into strength. His strategy depends on getting you to believe that your struggle is proof of your limitation, when in truth, it is evidence of your destiny. The enemy's tactics are subtle. He rarely confronts you through something obvious. He aims for the quiet places inside you, the places where unresolved fears and old insecurities still linger. He tries to distort your sense of identity before your identity has a chance to take shape. He creates confusion not because you are lost, but because clarity would expose the path you were meant to walk. The enemy thrives in the fog. If he can cloud your vision, he can influence your decisions. If he can influence your decisions, he can delay your growth. If he can delay your growth, he can keep you from stepping into the authority that was always meant to be yours. This is why spiritual attacks often begin early in life. The enemy recognizes purpose long before you understand it. He sees the spark before you see the flame. He knows what your voice could become before you ever speak with confidence. He knows what your compassion could heal before you understand the weight of your presence. So he moves quickly, planting seeds of fear, rejection, or inadequacy that take root deep enough to feel like your own thoughts. He uses people who doubt you to make you doubt yourself. He uses experiences that wound you to shape an internal narrative that says you are not enough. The more deeply those lies settle into your mind, the easier it becomes to silence the potential he fears. The enemy does not only attack your identity, he studies it. He watches the patterns of your reactions, the places where you hesitate, the moments when you retreat. the situations that trigger your insecurities. He learns how to push you without ever touching you. He learns how to break your focus by amplifying your fear. He learns how to exhaust your strength by overwhelming your thoughts. His goal is not to defeat you outright, but to wear you down slowly until you accept a version of yourself that is smaller than what God intended. He hopes you will settle for what is comfortable instead of confronting what is possible. The enemy also weaponizes emotion. He knows how to turn a temporary feeling into a permanent mindset. A moment of self-doubt becomes a belief that you are unworthy. A moment of silence becomes a belief that your voice has no value. A moment of fear becomes a belief that you are incapable of stepping forward. These emotional distortions are designed to sabotage the very parts of you that were meant to rise. The quiet person meant to lead. The sensitive person meant to discern. The wounded person meant to heal. The unsure person meant to carry wisdom. If he can keep you trapped in the emotional version of who you were, you will never become the spiritual version of who you are. Yet even in the enemy's strategy, there is a hidden revelation. The areas where you feel the strongest resistance are the areas where your calling is closest to emerging. The attacks reveal the blueprint of your identity. They expose the places where God is building something powerful. If you pay attention to where you are pressured the most, you will begin to see a pattern. Fear rises where courage is forming. Insecurity rises where influence is waiting. Doubt rises where vision is growing. Chaos rises where clarity is about to break through. Resistance is not random. It is targeted. And it is targeted because the enemy recognizes what you have not yet embraced. The greatest shift happens when you begin to interpret the attack correctly. Instead of asking why the battle keeps returning, you begin asking what it is trying to reveal. Instead of assuming the pressure means you are weak, you recognize it as confirmation that you are being prepared for something that requires more strength than you currently understand. The enemy's strategy loses its power the moment you realize what he is actually fighting. He is not fighting your weakness. He is fighting the strength hidden inside it. There is a reason your weakness feels heavier than it should. It is not only emotional weight, it is spiritual weight. When you look at the parts of yourself that feel unsteady, you are not looking at emptiness. You are looking at strength in its earliest form. Strength does not begin as confidence. It begins as tension. It begins as the ache of something stretching inside you. It begins as the quiet discomfort of realizing that what you fear is connected to what you are meant to carry. Weakness is the seed. Strength is the harvest. And every seed looks like nothing in the beginning. The treasure is always concealed before it is revealed. Every weakness carries a coded assignment. It is a message from God written into the fabric of your character, waiting for the moment when you become mature enough to understand it. The emotional wounds you try to hide are often the very wounds God uses to develop compassion, discernment, or authority. The enemy wants you to treat those wounds as disqualification, because he knows they are forming the qualities that will one day make you dangerous to him. He pushes you to avoid them so you never discover what God planted inside them. God often hides spiritual technology inside your most fragile places. That is why sensitivity can feel like a burden until it becomes discernment. That is why fear can feel like paralysis until it becomes vision. That is why silence can feel like oppression until it becomes wisdom. The transformation is not random. It is intentional. God builds strength through the areas that force you to depend on Him. Any strength that requires no surrender becomes pride. Any strength that requires no humility becomes unstable. Weakness ensures that the power forming inside you is anchored to the right source. When you look at Scripture, the pattern is unmistakable. God never chose people who felt naturally qualified. He chose people whose weaknesses were directly aligned with their calling. Moses stuttered, yet was called to confront Pharaoh. Jeremiah felt too young, yet was commanded to speak to nations. David was overlooked, yet carried the heart of a king. Peter was impulsive, yet chosen to build the church. Paul wrestled with his own limitations, yet carried the deepest revelations. Their weaknesses were not obstacles, they were indicators. They showed where God intended to place His glory. The transformation inside your weakness is not meant to be instant. It unfolds as you grow. Fear evolves into prophetic awareness when you stop running from it. Insecurity evolves into humility when you stop letting it define you. Sensitivity evolves into spiritual radar when you learn to trust what you feel instead of apologizing for it. Rejection evolves into resilience when you recognize that not being chosen by people does not mean you were not chosen by God. Fragility evolves into depth when you stop treating pain as punishment and start treating it as preparation. Many people never step into their true identity because they misinterpret the early stages of their strength. They feel fear and assume they are not courageous. They feel overwhelmed and assume they are not capable. They feel uncertainty and assume they are not called. They do not realize they are standing in the birthplace of their greatest qualities. What you call weakness is often the shadow form of the strength God is shaping. The shadow is always present before the structure becomes visible. You cannot despise the shadow and expect to see the fullness of what is coming. Your weakness is forming skills you cannot develop in comfort. It is teaching you to listen when you would rather react. It is teaching you to wait when you would rather rush. It is teaching you to empathize when you would rather defend. These qualities cannot grow in ease. They grow in the pressure you keep trying to escape. If you avoid your weakness, you avoid the strength God is trying to birth through it. There will come a moment when the places where you once felt shame become the places where others seek your wisdom. The struggles you tried to hide will become the experiences that give your voice weight. The tears you once saw as evidence of fragility will become the very waters that grow resilience inside you. God turns what wounded you into what shapes you, and what shapes you into what strengthens you. When you begin to understand the coded strength inside your weakness, you stop running from it. You stop apologizing for it. You stop treating it as something broken. Instead, you begin to see the outline of a calling that was always waiting beneath the surface. You start noticing how the very place where you feel the most tension is the place where God whispers the loudest. Weakness is not the enemy. Weakness is the doorway through which your destiny enters. There are seasons in your life when weakness feels like the only thing you can see. Everything inside you seems to tremble under the slightest pressure. You pray, but clarity comes slowly. You move forward, but confidence does not follow immediately. You push yourself, yet the results do not match the effort. In these moments, it is easy to assume that God has abandoned you or that you are somehow failing Him. But what you often do not realize is that weakness is one of God's most intentional tools. It is not a punishment. It is preparation. It is not the evidence of abandonment. It is the foundation of transformation. When God prepares someone for a calling that carries weight, He rarely starts with the strength they already possess. He starts with the weakness they try to avoid. Strength can be built by discipline, but depth can only be built by dependence. Weakness forces you to rely on a source greater than yourself. If you had all the clarity, you would stop seeking His voice. If you had all the strength, you would stop asking for His guidance. If you had all the confidence, you would forget who is carrying you. Weakness keeps you connected to the presence that is shaping your destiny. God often allows weakness to linger longer than you would prefer, because the process is doing something in you that power never could. Pressure builds foundation, struggle builds endurance, confusion builds discernment, delay builds trust. These qualities cannot be formed in comfort, and they cannot be learned through simple instruction. They must be lived. They must be walked through. They must press you until what is shallow breaks away and what is true rises to the surface. God is not trying to expose your weakness to shame you. He is exposing it so He can strengthen the parts of you that were never meant to carry things alone. There are moments when God restricts your abilities because He wants to protect your future. He will hold back certain opportunities until your character can sustain them. He will withhold certain positions until your identity is stable. He will close doors not because you are unworthy of them, but because you are not ready for the weight that comes with them. This is part of preparation. God does not build from the outside in. He builds from the inside out. Weakness reveals what is happening internally, so you do not collapse when He expands you externally. Weakness also becomes the meeting place between your humanity and His divinity. When you come to the end of your own understanding, you become more available to His. When you feel your strength fading, you lean into His presence more intentionally. When life outgrows your capacity, you realize that capacity was never meant to be the source. Weakness trains your heart to search for God instead of searching for control. It teaches you to surrender what you cannot fix and trust what He is shaping behind the scenes. There is a pattern in Scripture that is impossible to ignore. God never uses the strong without first breaking the illusion of their strength. He let Jacob limp before He let Jacob lead. He let Joseph be betrayed before He let Joseph carry authority. He let David face obscurity before He trusted David with a crown. The breaking was not destruction. It was preparation. The struggle was not rejection. It was formation. Weakness became the place where God built a capacity that would later carry favor, responsibility, and influence. If the foundation is not tested, the calling cannot stand. God also uses weakness to sharpen your discernment. When you feel vulnerable, you listen more closely. You notice what others ignore. You sense danger, deception, and spiritual shifts that a confident heart would miss. Weakness slows you down long enough to hear what He is really saying. It keeps you from moving ahead of Him. It keeps you from trusting your own impulses. It keeps you sensitive to His direction instead of becoming dependent on your own assumptions. Many people lose their way when they confuse confidence with calling. Weakness prevents that. It keeps your ear tuned to the voice that guides. As you begin to recognize how God uses weakness, something powerful shifts within you. You stop viewing it as a flaw that hinders you and start seeing it as a tool that shapes you. You stop feeling ashamed of the places where you tremble and start honoring them as the places where God meets you most intimately. You begin to understand that weakness is not a detour. It is the path. It is the method God uses to refine your purpose, your voice, your spirit, and your vision. There will come a moment when you look back and realize that the seasons you resented were the seasons that built you. The delays that irritated you were the delays that protected you. The wounds that humbled you were the wounds that softened you enough to feel what others cannot. What you once called weakness was the very place where God carved out the maturity and depth required for what He plans to build through you. The preparation was never meant to break you. It was meant to prepare you for the blessing that strength alone could never carry. There comes a moment in every journey when the pressure you once tried to escape becomes the doorway to understanding who you really are. It does not arrive with loud announcements or dramatic signs. It comes quietly, often in the same moments when you feel your weakest. This turning point happens when you finally stop running from the discomfort and start asking why it keeps returning. It is the moment when you recognize that what feels like constant struggle might actually be constant invitation. The resistance is not just something happening to you. It is something trying to awaken you. You begin to realize that weakness is not simply a place of vulnerability. It is a mirror, revealing the parts of you you have avoided for too long. The fear you feel is not a warning to retreat. It is a signal that you are standing in front of something connected to your identity. The insecurity you carry is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that something inside you has not yet been claimed. The doubts that haunt you are not proof of your inadequacy. They are reminders that you have not stepped into the strength waiting behind them. At the turning point, your questions begin to shift. You stop asking why things are difficult and begin asking what they are trying to teach you. You stop wondering why you struggle and begin asking who you could become because of it. You stop interpreting pressure as punishment and begin seeing it as formation. This shift does not happen overnight. It begins with a single moment of honesty, when you allow yourself to acknowledge that the place where you feel most fragile might be the place where God is working the most. The turning point often comes when you least expect it. Sometimes it appears after a disappointment you thought you would never recover from. Sometimes it rises after a failure that forces you to confront the truth you refuse to see. Sometimes it comes through a moment of clarity so subtle that only your spirit recognizes it. In every case, the turning point begins with awareness. You suddenly realize that the enemy has been attacking a part of you that you never bothered to protect because you never believed it mattered. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Awareness becomes the catalyst for transformation. This is when your past experiences begin to make sense. You look back and notice patterns that were invisible before. You recognize that the things that hurt you the most revealed the places where your calling is strongest. You begin to understand that your sensitivity has always been more than emotion. It was spiritual radar. Your silence was never avoidance. It was the groundwork for discernment. Your fear was never evidence of weakness. It was the signal of a gift forming before you had the language to describe it. At the turning point, you stop arguing with your purpose. You stop negotiating with your calling. You stop lowering your identity to match the expectations of people who never understood you. You begin accepting that you were never meant to fit into the places where your weakness felt like a burden. You were meant to grow into the places where your weakness becomes strength. This acceptance opens the door to clarity. You start to sense direction where there used to be confusion. You start to feel courage where there used to be hesitation. You start to recognize that the trembling inside you is not fear. It is transformation. The turning point shifts the entire atmosphere of your inner world. You stop seeing the enemy as a force that dominates you and start seeing him as a force that exposes your potential. Every attack becomes confirmation. Every doubt becomes a clue. Every struggle becomes instruction. What once felt like chaos begins to take on a new meaning. You start to understand that the enemy could not attack your future if you did not have one. He could not target your identity if you were not meant to walk in authority. He could not amplify your weakness if he did not fear the strength God placed inside it. When this awareness settles in your spirit, something powerful happens. You begin to rise in ways you never have before. Not because you feel strong, but because you finally understand why you felt weak. Not because the battle gets easier, but because you stop misinterpreting it. Weakness no longer scares you. It informs you. Instead of retreating, you step closer. Instead of hiding, you lean into the truth unfolding inside you. This is the turning point, the moment when everything begins to shift. From here on, you no longer move as someone intimidated by your own fragility. You move as someone discovering the strength that was hidden inside it the entire time. There comes a moment in your journey when you realize that the way you have been interpreting your life has been shaping your entire reality. You have been calling things weakness that were never meant to be labeled as such. You have been carrying meanings that were assigned to you long before you had the strength to question them. The reframe begins when you stop relating to your life through the lens of what hurt you and begin seeing it through the lens of what is being built inside you. This shift is not loud, but it is powerful. It is the moment when your entire understanding of who you are begins to shift into alignment with who you were always meant to become. You start to notice that what you once called sensitivity is actually the capacity to feel spiritual truths before they take shape. It explains why crowded rooms drain you and why certain conversations stay with you longer than you would prefer. That sensitivity was never emotional instability. It was the early form of discernment. You were never meant to be numb. You were meant to detect what others miss. For years you apologized for feeling too much. But what if that depth was designed to guide you rather than embarrass you? When this truth lands, something inside you straightens. The same happens with insecurity. You spent years wrestling with the feeling of not being enough. You tried to earn approval, fit expectations, and silence your own voice so you would not disappoint anyone. Yet insecurity, when reframed, reveals humility. It shows you how deeply you desire to get things right. It shows your willingness to grow. It shows your capacity to reflect before reacting. These qualities are the foundation of influence. People who have never struggled with insecurity often become rigid, blind to correction, or resistant to growth. You, however, were shaped by reflection. Your insecurity was not a curse. It was the soil where teachability grew. Rejection also changes its meaning when viewed through the right lens. You thought rejection meant you were not worth choosing. You thought doors closing meant you lacked something essential. You internalized the silence of others as proof that you were invisible. But rejection, once reframed, becomes protection. It becomes a boundary placed by God to keep you from aligning with people or environments that would suffocate who you are becoming. Sometimes the people who walk away were never meant to see the version of you that is emerging. Their exit created the space for the right voices, the right relationships, and the right opportunities to find you. What you called abandonment was often divine redirection. Even your silence carries a deeper meaning. You have been told that your quiet nature makes you less capable or less assertive. But what if your silence was never a flaw? What if it was preparation? Silence teaches you to observe before acting. It strengthens your intuition. It helps you hear what is underneath the words people speak. Silence is not weakness. It is wisdom and development. When you finally understand this, the shame you carried for being quiet dissolves, because you recognize that God often speaks the loudest to those who know how to listen. Fear, too, transforms when viewed through God's perspective. You believed fear meant you lacked courage, but fear is often the sign that you are standing in front of something that matters. It indicates a threshold, a doorway, a point of growth. Fear is not the enemy. It is the signal that destiny is near. When fear rises, it means you are touching the edges of something bigger than your comfort zone. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to step forward even while fear is still present. When fear is reframed, it no longer stops you. It guides you toward the areas where God is calling you to grow. As these reframes take shape inside you, your identity begins to stabilize. You stop living in reaction to your past and start living in alignment with your purpose. The narratives that once defined you lose their power, not because your circumstances changed, but because the meaning you give them changed. Strength emerges not from trying harder, but from seeing yourself correctly. This is the moment when you realize how deeply the enemy benefited from your misunderstanding. As long as you misinterpreted your weakness, you never recognized your strength. As long as you accepted the wrong story about yourself, you never stepped into the right one. Once the reframe takes root, your entire spiritual posture shifts. You stop begging God to take away your weakness and begin asking Him to reveal the strength inside it. You stop shrinking around people who misunderstand you and begin walking with confidence, knowing that your identity does not require their approval. You stop hiding the parts of yourself you once feared and begin embracing them as tools God will use to shape the world around you. What once felt like shame begins to feel like calling. What once felt like burden begins to feel like purpose. The reframe positions you for transformation. It prepares your heart for what comes next. You cannot walk into your destiny if you are still clinging to false definitions of who you are. The next season requires clarity, stability, and boldness. The turning point awakens you, but the reframe equips you. It gives you the language to understand your life. It gives you the courage to move differently. It gives you the foundation to embrace the calling that weakness has been pointing toward all along. There is a moment in every journey when knowledge is no longer enough, when understanding alone cannot carry you across the threshold into the life you were meant to live. This is the moment when truth must move from your mind into your spirit, when revelation becomes conviction, and conviction becomes movement. This is where the prophetic dimension touches your reality, not through dramatic signs or lightning strike moments, but through a quiet shift inside you that changes the way you stand, the way you think, and the way you fight. The prophetic impartation begins when you finally make room for God to speak into the exact places where the enemy tried to silence you. This impartation does not come to the strongest version of you. It comes to the honest version of you. It comes when you lay down the mask, when you stop pretending you are not tired, when you stop acting as if the pressure has not affected you. God does not pour strength into the disguise you show the world. He pours it into the real parts of you, the parts you hide because you assume they disqualify you. Yet these are the exact places where His voice speaks the loudest. The prophetic does not visit perfection. It visits surrender. As you open yourself to this moment, something shifts. The lies that have followed you for years begin to lose their authority. The voice that whispered that you were not enough begins to fade beneath the weight of revelation. You start hearing something different, something steady, something ancient and familiar. You begin to hear who you were before fear rewrote your identity, before insecurity narrowed your vision, before rejection reshaped your confidence. God begins restoring what life took from you. He speaks into the wounds you tried to ignore. He breathes strength into the places where you felt defeated. He calls out the version of you that has been buried beneath years of misunderstanding. The prophetic impartation is not a mystical experience. It is the moment when the truth becomes undeniable, when something deep inside you rises in agreement. It is when you recognize that your weakness was never a threat to God's plan. It is when you realize that the enemy fought so hard not because you were fragile, but because you were chosen. This awareness becomes a spiritual ignition. It awakens authority you did not know you carried. It stirs courage that had been dormant. It builds a foundation inside you that cannot be shaken by fear, opinion, or circumstance. In this moment, you begin to speak differently. You begin to pray differently. You begin to think differently. You realize that you cannot walk into your calling with the language of your old self. You must step into the identity that God has been trying to show you through every season of struggle. You begin to declare what you once doubted. You begin to stand in places where you once trembled. You begin to reach for things you once believed were beyond your reach. The prophetic impartation lifts your eyes from what you lost and makes you see what you are being built to carry. As this truth settles, you begin to sense something else, a direction. Not a roadmap with every step explained, but a knowing, a clarity, a peace that begins to guide you. You no longer feel driven by fear or pushed by insecurity. You feel led. You feel drawn. You feel aligned. It is the gentle but certain pull of purpose shaping your next steps. The prophetic does not always reveal the destination, but it clears the fog around your identity so you can move without hesitation. You walk not because you know everything, but because you finally trust the one who does. The impartation also releases a new kind of strength, the kind that does not depend on emotion or momentum. It is a strength that comes from conviction, the kind that cannot be shaken when life becomes unpredictable. It does not disappear when you are tired. It does not fade when you feel inadequate. It becomes a steady current running beneath every decision, every conversation, and every challenge. It is the strength that comes when you finally believe what God has been trying to tell you all along. In this moment, you realized that weakness was never the obstacle. It was the vessel for the impartation. The place you tried to hide became the place God chose to fill. The part of you that felt unworthy became the part He used to reveal your calling. The identity you doubted became the identity He confirmed. This is the prophetic impartation, a shift so deep that your life cannot continue in the same direction. Something has awakened. Something has settled. Something has begun. There comes a moment when a person realizes that the weakness they have been running from is not an enemy at all, but a doorway. It is the moment when the pressure becomes too heavy to keep pretending, too exhausting to keep managing an identity that was never meant to be carried alone. This moment often arrives quietly, not with dramatic signs or loud revelations, but with a subtle shift in the inner atmosphere. Something inside begins to whisper that the struggle has meaning. Something begins to move in the places you thought were dead. There is a stirring beneath the insecurity, a faint pulse beneath the fear, a gentle awakening beneath the doubt. And yet, even as this awakening begins, the enemy works overtime to keep you from recognizing it. Because if you ever discover what God has hidden inside your weakness, you become unstoppable. This is why confusion intensifies exactly when clarity is closest. It is why discouragement deepens right before perspective breaks through. It is why old habits resurface when new strength is forming. You are not going backward. You are being confronted with the very places that hold your calling. The enemy is not fighting what you were. He is fighting what you are becoming. And the hardest battles are not the external ones. They are the internal ones. The silent negotiations between who you have been and who you are meant to be. This internal war is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something is waking up. Weakness is not the failure you were taught to fear. Weakness is the one place where self-sufficiency cannot survive, where pride cannot pretend, where the illusion of control finally falls apart. In that fragile place, the truth becomes clear. You are not meant to carry your life on your own strength. You are meant to draw strength from a source that does not break. The enemy's strategy is to keep you so distracted by the shame of your weakness that you never discover the glory inside it. He keeps replaying old insecurities, old labels, old wounds, hoping they will blind you to the new identity forming under the surface. Yet even in the middle of this pressure, God is working with precision. He allows certain weaknesses to remain because they keep you close to Him. He allows certain unanswered questions because they train your discernment. He allows certain insecurities because they sharpen your dependency. And while you are frustrated by what feels like limitation, heaven sees preparation. You call it a weakness. God calls it a womb. It is the place where He forms the kind of strength that does not collapse under influence, attention, or success. It is the kind of strength that is anchored, tested, and real. There is also a deeper dimension you may not have considered. The enemy targets your weakness because he recognizes the gift hiding inside it. Sensitive people often carry prophetic clarity. Quiet people often carry spiritual depth. Those who struggle with fear often carry the capacity for profound courage. Those who feel unworthy often carry the gift of compassion. Every weakness carries an anointing in disguise. Every vulnerability contains a strength that has not yet taken shape. And the enemy studies these patterns long before you do. That is why he attacks them early. He aims at the seed because he fears the tree. But the moment you begin to see your weakness through God's perspective is the moment everything changes. Suddenly, the shame loses its power. Suddenly, the insecurity does not control the narrative. Suddenly, the fear does not get the final word. You start to understand that the very area you wanted to hide is the area God wants to breathe on. The very thing you thought disqualified you is the very thing that makes you usable. The very flaw you wished you could erase is the very place God wants to establish His strength. This realization is not merely inspiring, It is liberating. It shifts the entire trajectory of your life. Because once you see weakness as potential instead of punishment, you stop fighting yourself. You stop running from the parts of you that need grace. You stop competing with versions of yourself that were never meant to exist. You finally begin to stand in the truth that your identity does not hinge on perfection. It hinges on alignment. And when you align with what God sees in you, even your weakness becomes a testimony. Even your vulnerability becomes a weapon. Even your struggle becomes a signpost that points to the God who strengthens the broken and breathes purpose into the fragile. There comes a point in every person's journey where the pressure around them is not nearly as intense as the pressure within them. It is the inner stretching that reveals who you are and who you are not. The internal conflict between the version of you that has learned to survive and the version of you that is being shaped to lead. This pressure is not random. It is the molding force of destiny. And the reason it feels so heavy is because God is expanding you into a life that your old strength cannot carry. You are being stretched because something greater is being prepared inside you, something the enemy hopes you never discover. Most people assume the enemy attacks their weakness because it makes them vulnerable. But the truth is far more revealing. He attacks your weakness because he knows it is where your transformation begins. Growth never starts in the places where you feel confident or secure. It begins in the places where you feel exposed, uncertain, underdeveloped. These are the places where God speaks the loudest, not because he shouts, but because your pride is finally quiet enough to listen. Weakness creates a silence in the soul that makes discernment possible. And it is in that silence that purpose begins to take shape. When you feel pressure, it is not a sign that God has abandoned you. It is a sign that he is trusting you with a season of formation. Formation always precedes elevation. The enemy understands this pattern, which is why he aims to distort your perspective before the formation completes. If he can convince you that pressure means punishment, you will sabotage your own development. If he can make you believe that weakness means failure, you will run from the very environment where God is shaping your calling. If he can make you misinterpret the stretching, you will settle for smallness. That is why so many people never grow into the fullness of what they were created to be. They escape the pressure too soon. But pressure is the evidence of becoming. You feel the weight not because you are breaking, but because you are being tempered. Steel is only strong after it has endured heat. Gold is only pure after it has passed through fire. Seeds only rise after being buried in darkness. Strength is not built in comfort. Purpose is not born in ease. Identity is not formed in applause. It is shaped in the lonely places where you wrestle with the parts of yourself you do not yet understand. It is shaped in the moments where you confront the doubts that whisper you are not enough. It is shaped in the seasons where God strips away every illusion that kept you dependent on your own performance. The enemy does not fear your strength. He fears your surrender. Because once you surrender the illusion of perfection and step into the reality of grace, he loses his influence. You stop believing the lies that kept you small. You stop accepting the labels that kept you ashamed. You stop hiding the parts of you that were still in progress. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of the one who formed you. And when you see yourself clearly, your weakness no longer intimidates you. It becomes the place where God meets you, molds you, strengthens you, and prepares you. There is also a spiritual truth working beneath the surface. Every time God prepares to move you into a new season, he tightens the pressure around the areas that will carry the greatest weight. He strengthens your discernment because the next season requires clarity. He deepens your sensitivity because the next season requires spiritual awareness. He exposes emotional patterns because the next season requires maturity. He highlights internal wounds because the next season requires wholeness. Nothing is random. Every pressure point has purpose. Every weakness has instruction. Every struggle reveals a blueprint. This is where many people get confused. They mistake divine stretching for spiritual attack. They treat God's pruning as punishment. They interpret God's silence as rejection. They assume every discomfort is demonic. But discernment helps you recognize the difference. Not every painful moment is the enemy. Some are divine interventions designed to pull potential out of hiding. Some are surgical, not destructive. Some are meant to prepare you for blessings that require stronger foundations, deeper faith, and greater character. When you begin to see pressure as preparation, everything shifts. You stop running from challenges. You stop shrinking under insecurity. You stop apologizing for being in process. You allow God to finish what He started. You trust that the stretching has purpose. You realize that the weakness you once hated is the very place God chose to build your strength. And you begin to understand why the enemy targeted it so early. Because he saw the magnitude of what God placed inside you long before you ever recognized it. This is why you cannot give up now. The pressure you feel is not the end of your story. It is the evidence that your story is evolving. It is the sign that something powerful is forming beneath the surface. It is the confirmation that God is preparing you for a future that looks nothing like your past. And if you stay in the process long enough, the very weakness that once intimidated you will become the testimony that strengthens others. The pressure you feel right now is the birthplace of the strength you will walk in next. There is a moment in every person's life where clarity does not arrive as a loud announcement, but as a quiet shift inside the soul. A subtle realignment that feels almost like a whisper brushing against your spirit. This moment is rarely dramatic, rarely obvious, and almost never comfortable. It is the moment when God confronts the version of you that you have outgrown. And He confronts it not with condemnation, but with invitation. He doesn't expose your weakness to shame you. He exposes it to release you. But release always requires recognition. You cannot step into who you are becoming if you are still defending who you were. This is the moment when God begins to separate your true identity from your wounded identity. The wounded identity is the part of you shaped by past experiences, old fears, and outdated beliefs about yourself. It tells you to hide, to shrink, to stay safe, to avoid anything that might expose the parts of you that still feel fragile. The true identity is the part of you shaped by purpose. It tells you to rise, to step forward, to trust the process, to believe that what God placed in you is stronger than what life tried to take from you. The conflict between these identities creates friction. That friction is not a sign of failure. It is the sound of transformation. The enemy thrives in that friction. He plants lies in the cracks, hoping you will interpret the tension as a sign that you are not capable of change. He tries to convince you that your weakness is permanent, that your limitations are fixed, that your flaws define your future. He whispers doubts into the very places where God is trying to build confidence. He attacks your identity because identity determines direction. If he can keep you confused about who you are, he can keep you from stepping into who you are meant to be. Confusion is one of his most effective weapons because it paralyzes progress. But here is the truth the enemy never wants you to discover. Confusion often appears right before clarity. Chaos often appears right before breakthrough. Resistance often appears right before growth. Every time God begins elevating someone, He allows a season where the old identity feels too small and the new identity feels too unfamiliar. It is the spiritual equivalent of stepping into a room that feels slightly bigger than your voice. You are not yet comfortable, not yet confident, not yet steady. This is by design. God gives you space before He gives you strength. He gives you the atmosphere before He gives you the authority. Because authority without formation is dangerous. Influence without character is fragile. Calling without foundation collapses under pressure. This is why your weakness matters so much in this stage. not because it disqualifies you, but because it reveals what still needs strengthening. It shows you the areas where your identity has not yet caught up to your assignment. It uncovers the internal narratives that are inconsistent with who God says you are. It forces you to acknowledge the gaps, but not with despair, with awareness, with responsibility, with willingness to grow. God cannot heal what you hide. He cannot strengthen what you pretend is already strong. He cannot develop what you deny. But the moment you acknowledge your weakness with honesty, the moment you bring it into the light, the process of transformation accelerates. There is a divine strategy in how God does this. He does not wait until you feel ready to call you forward. He calls you forward so you can become ready. He does not wait for your strength to mature before He gives you your next step. He uses your weakness to mature your strength. He allows situations that challenge your internal stability, not to expose you, but to expand you. He brings opportunities that stretch your competence, not to overwhelm you, but to grow you. He places you in environments that require more than what you currently possess, not to embarrass you, but to prepare you for the future He designed. Identity shifts are not comfortable because they force you to confront who you thought you were. You begin realizing that some of the beliefs you held about yourself were never true. Some were inherited. Some were projected onto you. Some were formed by wounds. Some were shaped by fear. And as God begins to reveal who you actually are, those false layers begin to fall away. That falling away feels like loss, but it is actually liberation. You are not losing yourself. You are losing the version of yourself that was never aligned with your purpose in the first place. This is the part of the journey where you are invited to grow into the truth. Growth into truth always begins with letting go of what no longer fits. Letting go of the idea that weakness equals inadequacy. Letting go of the belief that vulnerability equals danger. Letting go of the assumption that you have to hide the parts of yourself that are still developing. Letting go of the fear that if people see your weakness, they will lose respect for you. Letting go of the lie that God regrets choosing you. God never chooses people because of their perfection. He chooses them because of their potential. He chooses them because He can see the strength hidden inside their weakness. And the enemy fears that strength. He fears what happens when you begin to believe the truth about yourself. Because once you recognize who you are in God, the lies lose their power. The insecurities lose their grip. The fear loses its influence. The weakness that once intimidated you becomes the doorway to a deeper, stronger, more anchored identity. And that identity is what unlocks your destiny. There comes a moment in your journey when God no longer allows you to hide behind the version of yourself that you created for survival. That version may have protected you in the past. It may have kept you safe when you had no strength. It may have helped you endure seasons where you were wounded and uncertain. But survival identities cannot lead you into destiny. They can only keep you in cycles. And when God decides it is time for your cycle to end, He begins removing every excuse, every crutch, every illusion that made the old identity feel necessary. Not because He wants to expose you, but because He wants to free you. Not because He wants to break you, but because He wants to build you without the scaffolding you once depended on. This is where the tension between weakness and calling reaches its sharpest point. You begin to feel the distance between who you currently are and who God is shaping you to become. That distance is not a failure, it is a signal. It is God showing you the gap so He can fill it. It is God revealing the cracks so He can reinforce them. It is God exposing what is unstable so He can rebuild it with strength that does not collapse under pressure. You are not being judged. You are being reconstructed. You are not being diminished. You are being refined. And refinement never feels gentle because it is designed to transform what is fragile into what is unbreakable. Your weakness plays a crucial role in that reconstruction. It forces you to rely on God in ways you never would if everything came naturally. It humbles your ego so your spirit can breathe. It removes the illusion of self-sufficiency so that your identity is no longer built on performance or perfection, but on presence. Weakness makes you teachable. It opens your heart to instruction. It softens the parts of you that have become hardened by disappointment or fear. It positions you to hear God with greater clarity because it silences the internal noise that pride creates. The enemy understands the power of that posture. He knows that a surrendered soul becomes a dangerous soul. He knows that a person who no longer hides their weakness becomes untouchable in the places that matter. So he tries to flood your mind with shame, hoping you mistake revelation for accusation. He tries to make you believe that your weakness disqualifies you from purpose rather than prepares you for it. He tries to magnify the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. But the enemy cannot stop what God is forming. He can only distract you from recognizing it. He can only tempt you to walk away before the process is complete. If you look closely at the seasons of your life, you will notice a pattern. Every time God was preparing you for elevation, He first brought you through a season where your weakness felt louder than your strength. That was not to discourage you. That was to anchor you. God will not allow your destiny to rest on anything unstable. He strengthens the foundation before He expands the structure. He builds the character before He increases the influence. He deepens the roots before He exposes the branches to the wind. You may not have recognized it then, but you can see it now. The seasons that felt like setbacks were actually the seasons that shaped you. This is why you can stop hiding. You can stop pretending to be stronger than you feel. You can stop apologizing for being in process. You can stop measuring your worth by how effortless you appear to others. You can stop believing that the parts of you that tremble are the parts God is disappointed with. Often, the trembling is the sign that you are stepping into something bigger than what you have known. Growth shakes you before it stabilizes you. Calling stretches you before it strengthens you. Destiny humbles you before it crowns you. Your weakness is not a liability. It is where God has chosen to demonstrate His power. It is the reminder that you are not doing this by yourself. It is the space where grace flows without resistance. It is the evidence that you have room to grow, room to evolve, room to expand into the identity that has been waiting for you since the beginning. When you bring your weakness to God, He does not recoil. He does not withdraw. He steps closer. He leans in. He begins shaping you with the precision of someone who sees the masterpiece beneath the rough edges. There is nothing about your weakness that surprises Him. There is nothing about your limitation that threatens His plan. There is nothing about your insecurity that changes His intention. God knew every flaw, every fear, every fragility, and He still called you. He still chose you. He still placed purpose inside you. And He intends to finish what He started. He intends to use the very places you once hid to reveal His glory. He intends to turn your greatest vulnerability into your greatest authority. He intends to transform what you once avoided into the area where you will one day lead others. So let this be the moment where you stop fighting your own becoming. Let this be the moment where you surrender the version of yourself that only knew how to survive. Let this be the moment where you allow God to shape you into someone stronger than your fear, wiser than your doubt, and more courageous than the voice that tells you to stay the same. You are not here by accident. You are not listening to this by coincidence. Something inside you is awakening, expanding, rising. Something inside you is ready to step into who you were always meant to be, and the enemy knows it. That is why the pressure has been so intense. That is why the battle has been so personal. Because your weakness is not your downfall. It is the doorway to your destiny. Closing prayer. God, in this moment, breathe clarity into every place where confusion has lived for too long. Lift the weight that is sat on their chest, the silent heaviness they never talked about, the doubts they tried to fight on their own. Let your presence settle over them like a steady hand, reminding them that nothing about their weakness intimidates you. Remind them that you have always seen the strength hidden beneath their fear, and that you have never once questioned who they are becoming. Speak into the places where their identity was bruised. Speak into the childhood wounds that tried to define their worth. Speak into the memories that still echo with lies. Replace every false belief with truth. Replace every narrative shaped by pain with a narrative shaped by purpose. Let them feel you rewriting the parts of their story they thought were permanent. Where the enemy whispered shame, speak dignity. Where the enemy whispered failure, speak restoration. Where the enemy whispered, "You're not enough," speak the identity you gave them before the beginning of time. Silence every voice that does not sound like you. Shut down every influence that tries to resurrect the version of them they have outgrown. Strengthen the hands that feel tired. Lift the head that feels heavy. Steady the heart that has been trembling under the weight of expectation. Let courage rise in the exact place where fear once lived. Let confidence grow where insecurity tried to take root. Let clarity unfold where doubt once clouded their vision. Reveal the purpose hidden inside their weakness. Show them the assignment that has been forming in the shadows. Show them the strength that has been maturing beneath the surface. Show them the future that fear has tried to keep out of view. And when they take their next step, let them feel you walking beside them, guiding them, protecting them, shaping them into the person you always intended. Cover their mind with peace that silences the storm inside. Cover their spirit with assurance that they are not behind. Cover their path with light that makes the next step visible. Let them know, beyond question, that their weakness is not the end of their story, but the beginning of the version of themselves they were created to become. Seal them with courage. Seal them with discernment. Seal them with the kind of strength that can only come from you. And let this be the moment that marks a shift, the moment they stop hiding from who they are and start walking boldly into who you called them to be. Amen.